The sun beat down relentlessly on Bramblehorn County, baking the earth until the dust hung thick in the air like a veil. The old wooden bleachers creaked under the weight of the crowd gathered for the annual horse auction. Each rancher and buyer dressed in worn boots and wide-brimmed hats, waiting for the ritual to begin. It was always the same. A parade of horses, quick sales, and the murmurs of men negotiating, their voices thick with the heat. Sheriff Frank Lewis leaned against the wooden fence at the edge of the arena, his eyes scanning the crowd with a practiced indifference. He'd seen it all before, every year. Horses paraded in and out of the ring like trophies, the buyers swooping in and taking what they wanted with little more than a glance. The town depended on this event, but to Frank, it was just another day in Bramblehorn. And then everything stopped. Wren O'Connor wandered into the middle of the arena, a small figure barely visible over the crowds, barefoot and wearing a dress so old and faded it might have been stitched together from scraps. The dirt clung to her skin, and her matted hair was plastered to her face, streaked with tears and dust. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was out of place in this world of tough ranchers and cattle barons. But she didn't seem to care. Her eyes were locked on the horse standing just inside the auction ring, Harlan. The chestnut horse was a shadow of his former self, his once shiny coat now dull, his ribs protruding through the skin. He stood there, trembling, his eyes dull with exhaustion. But there was something in them, something that held Wren's attention and held the attention of everyone in the crowd. She moved forward, slowly, as if the earth itself resisted her steps. She stopped beside Harlan, standing so close that their sides almost touched. She reached out and touched his mane, as though seeking comfort from the very animal that had brought her to this moment. She clutched a torn piece of saddle leather to her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Then her voice broke the silence, small and soft, but enough to slice through the thick tension hanging in the air. "Please don't take him. He saved me." The murmurs stopped. The buzz of the crowd died away. Everyone turned to look at her, uncertain whether to move, whether to speak. Frank felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. There was something about the girl, the sadness in her eyes, the desperation in her voice, that sent a chill down his spine. The auctioneer, Andis Dobson, cleared his throat and tried to regain control, but his usual smooth, practiced tone faltered. "Ah, miss?" he called out, his eyes darting nervously to the sheriff. "This ain't the place for a child. You need to step aside." But Wren didn't budge. Instead, her eyes never left Harlan's. She stepped closer to him, resting her hand on his side, as if they shared a secret only they understood. Sheriff Frank Lewis pushed off the fence and walked into the ring, his boots kicking up dust as he approached. He was a tall man, weathered from years of service in Bramblehorn, his face lined with age and experience. He wasn't one to show much emotion, but something about this moment struck him harder than he expected. "Hey there, little one," Frank said, his voice gruff but gentle. He crouched down to her level. "What's your name?" Wren looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and sorrow. "Wren O'Connor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He saved me. He pulled me out of the fire." Frank froze, his gut twisted. The fire. The Hillcrest Ranch fire. It had been over a year ago, a brutal tragedy that had claimed the lives of Thomas and Maggie Hillcrest. There had been no mention of a child surviving the fire. No mention of anything but the bodies they'd found and the horses that had been lost. He glanced at the horse, Harlan, and then back at Wren. There was something in her eyes that made Frank's heart sink. She was telling the truth, or at least she believed she was. "You were at Hillcrest Ranch?" Frank asked quietly, as the crowd behind him held their breath. Wren nodded slowly, her hand still resting on the horse's side. Yes, I wasn't supposed to be there, but I was. When the fire started, nobody came back for me, except him. He broke the gate, got me out, took me into the canyon. He never left me." Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. She had no more tears left. Frank looked at the horse again. The brand on his flank, the faded H, burned a hole in his memory. He'd seen that mark before. Hillcrest. The ranch had been a part of Bramblehorn for years, but this horse had never been mentioned in the reports. Frank knew the fire had taken everything from Hillcrest, but it wasn't just the buildings and animals. It was something deeper, something no one had talked about. Dr. Nora Bennett, the town's vet, moved up beside Frank, her sharp eyes narrowing as she looked at Harlan. She crouched down beside the horse, her fingers gently brushing against his coat. "He's been through something no horse should have to endure," she said, her voice steady. "Trauma, starvation, but there's something else. Something deeper." Frank turned to Dr. Bennett, his eyes hard. "What do you mean?" She looked up at him, her gaze soft but firm. "This horse is connected to that girl. He's not just protecting her. He's been through the fire too. Whatever happened at Hillcrest, it's marked him." The crowd was still silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Reverend Amos Tilley, who had been watching from the fence, now moved forward, his old bones creaking as he approached. He pulled his hat from his head, a solemn look on his face. "Did you say Hillcrest child?" he asked, his voice calm but full of disbelief. Wren nodded, her eyes never leaving Harlan. "I'm not their child, but they found me after my mama passed. Miss Maggie said I could stay. She said I was home, but when the fire came, they were gone, but he wasn't." The realization hit the crowd like a punch to the stomach. Hillcrest, the fire, the missing child. The story that had been buried beneath ash and smoke was finally starting to surface. Frank stood still, watching Wren and Harlan, his mind racing. The auction had been about horses and sales, but now it was about something far bigger, something the town wasn't prepared to face. And in that silence, the truth settled in. The air in Bramblehorn hung heavy with an unspoken tension. As the town gathered at the auction house the next day, the mood was different. The usual hum of chatter and the occasional clink of coins had been replaced with uneasy silence. The auction wasn't just about horses anymore. It was about something much deeper, something the town wasn't ready to confront. Sheriff Frank Lewis stood by the stables, his hands resting on the wooden rail as he watched the scene unfold before him. Wren O'Connor was still at the center of it all, sitting quietly beside Harlan in the shaded corner. The small piece of saddle leather still clutched tightly in her hands. It had become her lifeline, a connection to a past she couldn't let go of, and Frank could see that. The girl was bound to that horse, and the horse was bound to her in ways he couldn't explain. It wasn't long before Dr. Nora Bennett arrived, her boots crunching on the gravel as she walked over to Frank. She had a determined look in her eyes, but there was something else there. Something softer. Something that spoke of a woman who had seen too many animals suffer, and who now faced a different kind of trauma. "How's the horse?" Frank asked quietly, his voice low, as if the weight of the question itself was too much. Dr. Bennett sighed, her eyes glancing toward Wren and Harlan. "He's hanging on, barely. The trauma, the starvation. It's a lot for an animal to bear. But there's more, Frank. This horse isn't just fighting for survival. He's fighting for something deeper, something connected to her." Frank's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? What's going on between them?" Dr. Bennett shook her head. "It's hard to explain, but I've seen it before. An animal so bonded with a person, so tied to their survival, that it becomes a part of them. Harlan saved Wren, but it's more than just instinct. He's tethered to her in a way that I've never seen before." Frank didn't speak right away. He turned to look at the girl again, sitting so still beside the horse. The bond between them was undeniable. It was as if they had both survived the fire together, as if they were two halves of a whole that had been torn apart but had somehow found each other again. "You think the fire did this to him?" Frank asked after a long pause. Dr. Bennett nodded. "I do. The scarring on his body, the dislocated hip. This wasn't just some accident. He carried her through that fire, Frank. He saved her life. And now he's holding on for her. But it won't be long before the weight of it breaks him. He's been through too much." Frank took a deep breath, staring down at the ground. "And the girl? What do we do about her?" Before Dr. Bennett could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Wren stood up, her small frame still so fragile but somehow resolute. She walked toward them slowly, her eyes still locked on Harlan, who stood shakily on his own, leaning into her for support. Frank felt a pang of something in his chest. Pity, maybe, or perhaps something deeper. He wasn't sure, but looking at Wren, he couldn't help but feel a fierce protectiveness rise within him. She was just a child, lost in the aftermath of something that had stolen everything from her. And now she was here, with nothing but this horse. Wren stopped in front of Frank and Dr. Bennett, her eyes still wide, full of sadness and something else, something stronger, like she knew more than anyone had yet realized. "Can you save him?" she asked. Her voice small but steady. Frank crouched down to her level, looking her in the eyes. "We're doing everything we can, Wren," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "But we need to figure out what happened at Hillcrest. We need to know the truth." Wren nodded, but her face remained unchanged. She wasn't a child who cried easily. She had learned, long before this, that tears wouldn't fix what was broken. "Tell me about the fire," Frank urged gently. "What happened?" Wren looked away, her eyes fixed on Harlan's trembling form. "The fire started when I was sleeping. I didn't hear it at first, but Harlan did. He broke the gate and got me out. He carried me away from the fire. We hid in the canyon for days. He never left me." Frank's heart tightened. He had been a sheriff long enough to know when someone was hiding something, but Wren didn't look like she was hiding anything. She was telling the truth. The girl and the horse had been through something unimaginable, and it was clear to Frank that they were still living in the aftermath of it all. "But how did you survive, Wren?" Dr. Bennett asked, her voice gentle. "If the fire was as bad as you say, how did you make it through without anyone coming for you?" Wren's eyes flicked to the ground, and for a moment Frank thought she might shut down. But instead she took a deep breath and said quietly, "They never came for me. No one came looking. After they were gone, Harlan stayed with me. He never let me be alone." Dr. Bennett exchanged a glance with Frank. There was something about the way Wren said those words that struck them both. Something more than just the girl's story. It was a feeling, an energy, like Wren had lived through something more than fire. She had survived abandonment, and Harlan had kept her alive when the world had forgotten about her. As the conversation continued, the town's elders began to gather around the stable, each one of them hearing snippets of Wren's story and looking at Harlan with new eyes. There were murmurs of disbelief, some questioning if the girl could really be telling the truth. But the evidence was in front of them, in the scars on the horse's body, in the unshakable bond between him and Wren. Reverend Amos Tilley, who had been standing silently in the background, finally stepped forward. He had seen his share of hardship in this town, but something about this situation stirred something deep within him. He placed a hand on Frank's shoulder and said softly, "If what this girl says is true, we've missed something. Something important. This town has failed her. and we can't let that happen again." Frank looked at him, his expression hardening. "We can't undo the past, Amos. But we can do something now. We have to decide what we stand for." The weight of the decision hung over them, and Frank knew that whatever happened next, it would change the course of this town's future. The fire at Hillcrest had brought them here, but it was Wren and Harlan who would determine where they went from here. As the day dragged on, word spread through Bramblehorn that something was happening. A change was in the air. And despite the uncertainty, despite the questions that remained unanswered, one thing was clear. Wren O'Connor wasn't going anywhere. She had survived, and now the town would have to decide if they were going to help her heal. Sheriff Frank Lewis had never been one to believe in coincidences. And yet, standing in the barn with Wren and Harlan, the weight of this entire situation felt like one unrelenting storm that had swept through Bramblehorn, leaving nothing the same. It had been 3 days since Wren had revealed the truth about Hillcrest Ranch, the fire that had taken everything from her. The town was still reeling from the revelation, but they hadn't had much time to process. There were papers to sort through, calls to make, and a decision that had to be made about Wren's future. But the more Frank looked at her, the more he knew that no decision could come from anything other than the truth. Wren and Harlan were inseparable. Their bond something so raw and undeniable that it was impossible to ignore. The girl had witnessed horrors that no child should ever see, and yet here she was, still standing, still holding onto the horse who had carried her through it all. Frank couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for her quiet strength. It was a strength that had only just begun to show itself. Dr. Nora Bennett had been busy, working with Harlan to stabilize him as much as she could. His physical condition had worsened in the last few days. He was weak, starving, and his trauma had clearly taken its toll. But there was something in his eyes, something more than the exhaustion, that told Dr. Bennett that the horse had more fight left in him than anyone realized. Frank was leaning against the stable door, his eyes fixed on Wren as she sat next to Harlan, brushing his coat gently. She hummed an old song, a tune Frank didn't recognize, but one that seemed to comfort the horse. It was a soft melody, one that seemed to soothe the pain that clung to them both. "She's remarkable, isn't she?" Dr. Bennett's voice interrupted Frank's thoughts. She was standing behind him, her arms crossed as she watched Wren and Harlan. Frank didn't respond right away. He just nodded. "She is." "She's been through more than most adults," Dr. Bennett continued, her tone softer now. "And yet look at her. She's holding it together for that horse. It's like she's not just surviving, she's healing him too." Frank glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "But can she? Can either of them really heal?" Dr. Bennett sighed and stepped forward. "It's not just about healing, Frank. It's about loyalty. That's what this is. These two have been through hell together. And now, they're clinging to each other in ways that go beyond what any of us can understand." Frank couldn't help but look back at Wren. She hadn't flinched when they spoke. She knew they were talking about her, but her focus remained entirely on Harlan. There was no fear in her gaze, no hesitation. Just quiet, unwavering determination. The past few days had been a blur of questions, but none of them seemed to have an answer. The fire at Hillcrest Ranch, how had it happened? Why had no one come for Wren? Why was there no record of a child living there, of a girl who had survived? Sheriff Lewis had gone through the old fire reports, but there was nothing. No mention of Wren, no sign that anyone had even searched for her. He'd talked to the fire chief who had worked the case when it all went down, but there was nothing new to be found. The fire had consumed everything. Documents, records, even memories. And then there was the question of Harlan. His injuries were consistent with something much more severe than simple neglect. His body had been pushed to its limits, but it wasn't just the physical trauma that concerned Frank. There was something in the way the horse behaved, something that suggested he had carried Wren through the fire. His wounds weren't just from the flames, they were from carrying the weight of a child. "What do we do now?" Frank asked, turning to Dr. Bennett. He knew that, as much as she had seen in her years of practice, this was something entirely different. Dr. Bennett ran a hand through her hair. "We keep them together," she said, her voice firm. "Wren needs him, and Harlan needs her. This is about more than just survival now. They've both suffered. But they've also found each other, and that's something worth protecting." Frank nodded. He understood the logic, but there was more at play here than just simple protection. Wren was a child who had been through something no one should ever go through. And yet, here she was, more mature than anyone expected, holding Harlan like he was the last thing in the world she had left. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty ground outside the stable, Frank walked over to the fence where Mayor Ethan Caldwell was waiting. The mayor had been quiet the past few days, his usual confidence shaken by the discovery of Wren and the horse's past. Frank could tell he was struggling with the idea of what to do next. Bramblehorn wasn't used to outsiders, especially ones with so many unanswered questions. "I can't help but feel like we're making a mistake," Mayor Caldwell said quietly, not meeting Frank's eyes. "What if we're wrong about all of this? What if there's more to her story than we know?" Frank leaned against the fence, his gaze fixed on the setting sun. "What if we're right, Ethan? What if this is the second chance we're being given?" The mayor didn't respond right away. He just stared out over the open fields, lost in thought. Finally, he spoke again, his voice soft. "What if we've failed her before, Frank?" Frank exhaled slowly. He knew the weight of that question. The town had failed Wren once. They had turned their backs when she needed them most, but now they had a chance to make things right. They had a chance to protect her, to give her the life she deserved. "We won't fail her again," Frank said, his voice resolute. As the night drew on, the town remained silent. Everyone was waiting for something to happen. Something that would give them answers. Something that would give them a direction. But for Frank, the answer was simple. Wren O'Connor wasn't going anywhere, and neither was Harlan. Together, they had found their place in Bramblehorn, and it was time for the town to accept that. But acceptance wouldn't come easily. Not for the town, and certainly not for Wren and Harlan. They had both seen too much, suffered too long, but somehow in this small, weathered town, they would find the space to heal. Together. The morning after the decision was made, the town of Bramblehorn seemed to breathe differently. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet kind of anticipation that hung over every corner of the sleepy town. For the first time in a long while, Sheriff Frank Lewis felt the weight of what was coming, not just for Wren, but for the town itself. As he sat in his office that morning, the papers spread out in front of him, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something monumental. The town had made its choice. Wren O'Connor would stay in Bramblehorn. But that decision had set off a chain of events that none of them were prepared for. Frank's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," he called, glancing up as Mayor Ethan Caldwell stepped into the room, his face drawn and tired. "I just got off the phone with the state," the mayor said, his voice low. "They're not happy. They want Wren moved immediately, and they're sending someone out to collect her." Frank felt his jaw tighten. "I figured this was coming." The mayor nodded. "I tried to stall them, but it's out of my hands now. The state's not going to sit by and let us just take this girl in without proper papers, proper records. The legalities are clear." Frank stood up, his hands resting on the edge of his desk. "What do we do now?" The mayor hesitated. "We fight, but it won't be easy, not with the state breathing down our necks. I've already called a meeting with the town council. We need to come up with a strategy, and fast." Frank's mind raced. It was a fight that could divide the town, tear it apart. The people of Bramblehorn were simple folk, but they had strong values, and most of them didn't take kindly to outsiders telling them what to do. But at the same time, Frank knew that the town couldn't ignore the truth of what had happened to Wren. She was a survivor, and she had earned her place here. The next few hours were a blur. The town hall meeting was called, and the entire town gathered in the small wooden building. The air was thick with uncertainty as everyone took their seats. Frank could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on them, but there was no turning back now. Wren and Harlan were both in the front row, with Wren holding onto the horse's lead rope, her small frame standing resolute. There were murmurs from the crowd as people took their seats, some excited to see what would happen, others unsure of where they stood. Frank stood at the front, his hand resting on the lectern as he faced the group. The meeting was led by Mayor Caldwell, who opened the floor for discussion. The first to speak was Reverend Amos Tilley. "We're at a crossroads, folks," he began, his voice steady, though there was a visible strain in his eyes. "We can follow the law, send Wren away and pretend like nothing happened. Or we can stand up for what's right and keep her here. We've failed her before, and now we have a chance to make it right." The crowd was quiet, all eyes on Reverend Tilley. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained silent. Frank could feel the division growing, like a slow, spreading crack in the foundation of the town. This wasn't just about Wren anymore. It was about who they were, what they stood for, and what kind of community they wanted to be. Dr. Nora Bennett spoke next, her voice clear and firm. "Wren and Harlan have been through more than most of us can imagine. Harlan saved her life. He kept her alive when no one else came for her. And now we have to decide whether we're going to let her continue to survive or if we're going to take that away from her." Mayor Caldwell raised a hand to quiet the room. "I don't think anyone here doubts that Wren deserves a chance," he said. "But we're talking about the law. We're talking about custody, about paperwork, about responsibilities that go beyond just what we think is right. The state doesn't care about our personal feelings. They care about the rules." Reverend Tilley stood up again, his voice louder this time. "I understand the law, Ethan, but the law isn't always right. It wasn't right when we let that fire happen, when we let Wren disappear without anyone looking for her. And it's not right now, when we're talking about tearing her away from the one thing that's kept her alive, the horse who saved her." There was a long pause as the crowd murmured among themselves. Frank could see the conflict in their faces. Some were torn, unsure of how to proceed, but others, like Reverend Tilley and Dr. Bennett, were standing firm, unwilling to let Wren be taken away again. And then, as if on cue, Sheriff Frank Lewis spoke up, his voice steady and commanding. "I've been a lawman for a long time," Frank said, his eyes scanning the room, "and I've seen plenty of things in my career, but I've never seen anything like this. Wren and Harlan, they're not just some legal case, they're not some paper to be filed away. They're living, breathing people, and they've been through hell. If we let the state take her, we're letting them erase everything she's fought for." The room fell silent. For the first time, the entire town seemed to be listening. Frank felt the weight of their gazes on him, and for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he had to do. "We don't need permission to do what's right," Frank continued. "Wren has a right to be here, and if we let the law take her, we're telling every child in this town that they don't matter. were telling them that their survival doesn't count. The room was still, but a shift had occurred. Frank could see it in the eyes of the townspeople. They were waking up to the truth of what had been laid before them. This wasn't just about a girl and a horse. It was about their collective responsibility to each other, to the community they had built, and to the values they wanted to protect. Finally, Mayor Caldwell stood up, his face a mixture of frustration and resignation. "So, what are you suggesting, Frank? That we defy the state? Go against everything we've built here?" Frank stepped forward, his voice resolute. "I'm suggesting we do what's right. I'm suggesting we fight for Wren. We fight for her, for Harlan, and for what this town is supposed to stand for." The mayor looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the townspeople who had begun to nod in agreement. Slowly, he sighed and lowered his head. "All right then," he said quietly. "We'll fight, but we'll do it together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and for the first time, the tension in the room seemed to lift. The town had made its decision. They would stand by Wren. They would stand by Harlan. And together they would face whatever came next. The days following the town meeting were filled with a quiet kind of chaos. The decision to fight for Wren and Harlan had been made, but it was clear that the road ahead would not be easy. Sheriff Frank Lewis had seen his fair share of tough situations, but this felt different. It was as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting to see if they could uphold the promise they'd made to the girl and the horse who had come to mean so much to them. Frank stood on the porch of his small office that morning, watching the dust swirl in the hot wind. The town of Bramblehorn felt like it was holding its collective breath, waiting for the next move. He had spent the last few days preparing for the inevitable. State officials were coming, and there was no stopping that. But Frank had made up his mind he would fight for Wren, and in the process he knew he was fighting for more than just her. He was fighting for the soul of Bramblehorn. Inside the town hall, the tension was palpable. The council meeting was underway, and it was clear that emotions were running high. Mayor Ethan Caldwell, once the pillar of Bramblehorn's political landscape, now seemed weighed down by the decision he had made. It was a decision that went against the grain of everything he had worked for, but it was the right decision. The town had chosen, and he had chosen to stand with them. Sheriff Frank Lewis stood by the window looking out over the town. It had been a week since the vote, and while the legal battle was just beginning, something had shifted in Bramblehorn. The town had come together in a way that they hadn't in years. For the first time in a long time, people were talking, not just about the horses or the cattle, but about the girl and her horse. And in that silence, Frank saw something important, something worth protecting. "Frank," came a voice from the doorway. Dr. Nora Bennett entered, her expression thoughtful. "We're going to need to be prepared. The state's not going to just back down. They're sending someone to investigate. I'm not sure how long we can keep this fight going." Frank turned, his eyes meeting hers. "I know, but we'll make them see reason. Wren and Harlan belong here. They've earned their place, Nora, and I'm not letting anyone take that away from them." Dr. Bennett nodded, but there was worry in her eyes. "We can only fight for so long, Frank. At some point, the law has to win. Then we'll make sure the law sees what's right," Frank said firmly. "We're not going to let them destroy what we've built here." It was a sentiment that echoed through the rest of the town's leaders, though not without resistance. Reverend Amos Tilley had been at the forefront of the effort, his unwavering belief in doing the right thing inspiring others to stand with Wren and Harlan. But even Tilley could see the difficulty of their position. The state had laws, and those laws didn't care about a girl and a horse. As the week passed, the tension between Bramblehorn and the state grew. state officials began arriving in town, demanding to speak with Mayor Caldwell and the town council. They were firm in their stance. Wren and Harlan would be removed from Bramblehorn, and no amount of local sentiment would change that. The day the state official arrived, Frank stood at the edge of the stables, watching the dust settle around the meeting as the town's leaders gathered to confront the reality of what was at stake. He could hear the voices in the distance, but he didn't need to be there. He knew the conversation that was taking place. He had been a part of it before. The legalities were clear, but the heart of the matter was not. Frank had seen too many people try to do the right thing only to be crushed by bureaucracy. But he wasn't going to let that happen here. The official, a tall man in a sharp suit named Harold Mitchell, stepped into the center of the gathering. His face was set, and his voice was sharp as he addressed the townspeople. "I'm here to oversee the transfer of Wren O'Connor into state custody," Mitchell began. "This town has no legal claim over her. The paperwork is clear. She has no guardian. She's a ward of the state." Frank could feel the heat rising in his chest. He had heard this before. He had watched too many people lose everything because of a piece of paper, a rule, a law that didn't account for the human element. "We're not letting her go," Frank said, his voice unwavering. "You can take your papers and your rules, but Wren O'Connor has a place here, and we're not giving her up without a fight." The words hung in the air, heavy with defiance. The crowd that had gathered around the town hall seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't just about Wren anymore. This was about the town itself, about what it stood for and who it protected. And Frank knew that no matter what happened, he would never back down from this fight. Mitchell narrowed his eyes. "This is a matter of law, Sheriff. You can't just bend the rules because you feel sorry for her." "It's not about feeling sorry," Frank replied, stepping forward. "It's about doing what's right. This girl survived something you can't even begin to understand. And that horse? He saved her. And you think you can just take her from here? From the one thing that's kept her alive?" Mitchell hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Wren, who stood in the background holding on to Harlan as if he were her anchor to the world. The emotion in her gaze was raw, unyielding. It was a look that made Mitchell pause, and for just a moment Frank saw something shift in his eyes. He wasn't sure if it was doubt or something deeper, but he saw it. "We can fight for a few more days," Frank said, his voice steady. "But in the end, the decision is ours, and we're not backing down. Wren and Harlan stay in Bramblehorn, end of story." It was then that the townspeople began to speak up, their voices rising in a chorus of agreement. They had made their decision, and in that moment, the weight of the town's history, of its values, of its heart, was laid bare for all to see. The final vote came swiftly, though not without some hesitation. But in the end, the town stood together. Wren O'Connor and Harlan were not going anywhere. They had found their place in Bramblehorn, and no one was going to take that away from them.